Before we begin, a preface to this video. Like many others, I am beyond frustrated with Game Workshop's decision to go after their most ardent fans, to the point where I am considering not focusing on their lore any longer. I mean, after all, why bother bringing more attention to their stuff if they're going to punish their community just for doing so? But still, prior to lashing out, I thought it's only fair to see what led us here. I mean, I can even understand the logic that led some foolish new executive to think that this was a good idea. After all, Warhammer's only value is in its IP. Its minis are far more expensive than the competition, much of their modern games are shovelware, and the books would not have anywhere near the reach that they enjoy without the Warhammer name attached. Thus, locking down their IP means they can still retain that income for themselves. After all, we saw similar actions from both Disney and Nintendo, so why not Games Workshop? Well, the difference between those two is scale. Virtually everyone knows Disney and Nintendo's properties. They are among the most well-known brands in the entire world. Young, old, man, woman, socialite, introvert. Even if you don't personally care about Disney or Nintendo, you at the very least know of them. They don't need to establish their brand. They have a dominant global reach. Games Workshop, in comparison, is a medium-sized fish in a very small pond. In the mini space, they are unquestionably the largest company, but minis are a tiny market. Sales figures in 2016 were 1.4 billion. That's not Games Workshop sales or even tabletop war games. That's the sales of all tabletop games combined, and of that, Warhammer would represent just a sliver of that total. As a point of reference, just Disney Plus is projected to make $10 billion this year, and that's ignoring the theme parks, licensing deals, merchandising, and everything else that Disney makes money from. Nintendo has made 10 times the entire value of the tabletop market the last 3 years in a row. We mentioned how virtually everyone knows Disney and Nintendo. Outside of your immediate group of friends, how many people do you think even know who Games Workshop is? But that's enough preamble. Let's go back and see what might have led Games Workshop to end up with the decisions that they've made. This is going to be a longer video than normal, so cozy up, pour an extra big glass of milk, and let's get right into it. I suppose no story would be complete without starting at the beginning. Games Workshop first appears in 1975, selling wooden boards for public domain games such as Backgammon and Go. They would also score distribution rights for Dungeons & Dragons in their opening year, which would be crucial as one of their three founders would leave the company just a year later, disliking the direction he thought it was heading in. This would be especially problematic for the startup company because the individual that left was the founder who provided their primary income stream. Still, they managed to stave off bankruptcy and actually managed to expand in those shaky early years. This was partially down to those Dungeons & Dragons rights, but it also came down to an intelligent strategy. In promoting and running game conventions, they were managing to bring attention and buyers to their business. This essentially let them both advertise and sell with a singular action, meaning they could effectively make money while simultaneously expanding their reach. In case this means little to you, understand that for many companies, advertising is their single greatest expense. To make money from doing so isn't just rare, it's miraculous. And remember that point because we will be touching on it later. 2 years after launch, they had happily expanded their licensing deals by giving publishing rights for Call of Cthulhu, RuneQuest, Traveler, and the Middle-earth role-playing game for the local markets. They would use this money to bankroll Citadel Miniatures to produce metal miniatures for its various licensed games, and also for some generic wargaming miniatures, and this general distribution model would hold up for 9 years until the introduction of Tom Kirby in 1986. Kirby's presence would begin to pivot Games Workshop into the company that we know today, but in order for him to set it in that new direction, the remaining two founders needed to go. Bringing in Brian Ansell that same year, his presence was needed in order to buy out the remaining management to the tune of £10 million each in 1991. The two would realize that there was far more money to be made in shamelessly plagiarizing the IPs that they were involved with than there was in simply publishing and distributing them, and they decided instead to focus exclusively, or at least mostly exclusively, on their own content lines. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. While this was a commercial success, there was a bit of a feeling of betrayal from both early fans and even employees within the company. 1986's White Dwarf 77 would have a section where the descriptions of all the items would go on to read, "Sawed off Brian Ansell," and in 1990, two employees within the company would band together to start a competitor called Folio Games. They would unfortunately just shutter 3 years later, but the damage was done. Games Workshop, meanwhile, had found the capital to expand throughout the Commonwealth countries and even into the US. If there was any doubt to its new corporate direction, those doubts would be silenced when the company was picked up by a private equity firm in 1994 and put onto the London Stock Exchange shortly thereafter. This new presence would clearly make an impression on at least one company, as a relatively small, unknown company at the time named Blizzard would step forward and request the rights to the Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k licenses for two games that they were actively working on. Games Workshop declined the offer at the time, so the small company would change enough things within to skirt IP legislation and then release them under their own titles, Warcraft and Starcraft. Thank goodness Games Workshop dodged that bullet though, because those games would only go on to make billions of dollars. Whoops. But I bring them up for a reason. The fact that those games so blatantly stole from Games Workshop's rightfully stolen ideas would surely plant the seed in Kirby's head, as the company would do two very notable things in the next decade. First up, they would begin to license out their IP to other video game developers in order to try and capitalize on their IP, lest they miss out on the next billion-dollar franchise. And secondly, and perhaps far more noteworthy, they would try to sue any company that even looked like they'd once seen a Warhammer model in court, provided that they could afford to take them on. You see, as much as Games Workshop would have loved to have gone back and gotten its revenge on Blizzard, the genie was already out of the bottle. Blizzard was now bigger than Games Workshop even was. A weak IP lawsuit would damage Games Workshop far more than the video game developer. Ironically, for you historians out there, Games Workshop would go on to copy the Zerg's aesthetics for the next generation of Tyranids, leading to a weird Ouroboros where Blizzard wanted to mimic the Tyranids, but wasn't allowed to, so they changed their aesthetic to become the Zerg, which Games Workshop would see and decide to mimic in order to use for their own Tyranids that they didn't allow Blizzard to use in the first place. This is perhaps Games Workshop's best and worst era, wrapped into a single time period. Let's start on the positive notes. Games Workshop extracurricular stuff was at its best. Their mainline Warhammer Fantasy Battle and Warhammer 40,000 lineups will be joined by Blood Bowl, Necromunda, Warhammer Quest, Space Hulk, Man of War, Epic, Warmaster, Mordheim, Inquisitor, and Battlefleet Gothic, which we'll be discussing in a future episode. And for the first time in a long time, video games within the Warhammer universe were given a proper effort, and huge names in the third-party space were brought in, like THQ and EA. This led to games like Shadow of the Horned Rat, Dark Omen, the first Space Hulk, Fire Warrior, Chaos Gate, and of course the absolutely incredible Dawn of War. These would all be released under Kirby's leadership. All in all, it was a great time for new fans of the series to get involved with the lore without having to commit to the expensive tabletop game that they might not have thought of. But for all the new fans, old fans found themselves in an awkward position of supporting a company that was, by all accounts, stifling the industry. Owing to their dominant position in the market, Games Workshop was effectively able to shut down anything that it considered to be a threat. Now, before we get into the list of examples, if you're wondering why anti-monopoly laws didn't prevent this, it's important to note that anti-monopoly laws, or more accurately anti-consumer protections, they don't have a carte blanche effect. They require lawmakers to be aware of this market dominance, not be apathetic towards the situation, and then go forth and try to oppose it in court. My business, for example, exists in a space where there's virtually no one left because a $14 billion company has shown up and bought out virtually every competitor in the entire market. Those that it couldn't buy out or didn't want to, it simply started restricting access to equipment, which would make it even more dominant. After all, those that it doesn't own still have to buy from it after all. However, it's in a field that I bet 99% of you have never even heard of or thought about, audiometry equipment, so there's never been an attempt by lawmakers to prevent them from continuing to buy up the market. I bring this up because in Games Workshop's case, that's pretty much what saved them for the majority of this aggressive litigation period. No one really cared that they were taking out smaller competitors in courts or bullying retailers into favorable trades because it's a very niche hobby. In case you're wondering how them being big lets them take out their competitors, you can think how overwhelmingly expensive litigation is. A company that has maybe $10,000 worth of available income isn't going to be able to take on a company with a few £1,000,000 of available income who can simply tie them up in court for a year or two. In almost every single case, these smaller companies were better off simply settling for whatever Games Workshop's legal team offered them because the alternative was basically letting morality lead them to bankruptcy. In any case, this lawsuit-happy time would truly kick off in the mid-noughts, perhaps ironically for this video, by shutting down a fan film. Having initially been given the go-ahead by Games Workshop, Damnatus would eventually go on to be shut down by GW several years after production started, virtually directly before release. Just to further salt the wound, Games Workshop would then immediately amend its IP policies to the now infamous no fan films allowed, the way that they are now, with that same amendment having been what's led to the firestorm of recent controversy. Even now, 15 years later, Damnatus remains fully completed and ready to roll as a feature-length film, but it will not be allowed to be released. Now, you might think that makes some sense as it would compete with the upcoming Warhammer Plus subscription, except Warhammer Plus didn't exist back in the time this lawsuit started. Heck, streaming services were barely even a thing, and Disney Plus hadn't been invented for Games Workshop to steal the naming convention of yet. This was, by all accounts, a strike against their own community, and with Games Workshop standing to gain nothing from it. But this would be far from their only attack against their own fans that Games Workshop would go on to make. Before people could react to the previous lawsuit, Games Workshop immediately moved on to its next hit, Vassal. Vassal was an open source board game where fans could plug in their own rule sets to play whatever game they wanted or even create brand new ones. As you would expect, someone invariably created a 40,000 rule set for it, and this was all that Games Workshop needed to go on the offensive, as a board game with their rules and IP was a direct competitor to them. While they succeeded in scrubbing any attempts at hosting Warhammer-related content, Vassal itself thankfully survived owing to its open source nature. There was effectively no entity to sue for it, and it was already out and in the wild. Among the various lawsuits they would launch, this would stand out as being the only one that made any kind of sense, as the fan-injected rules did in fact run a direct threat to Games Workshop's product, especially considering they are primed to relaunch Talisman, one of the listed rule sets, online in the coming year. But Games Workshop wasn't done yet. They would go on to launch another attack on its own fans just 2 years later. Next on the hit list was Board Game Geek, which had summaries of the rules for the out-of-print games. If you've never played the tabletops, Games Workshop doesn't produce the side games forever. They eventually stopped producing and supporting them, so Board Game Geek brought it upon themselves to recap how to play these out-of-print games. Again, this was exclusively done by fans to preserve something that they had already bought from Games Workshop and to try and kindle interest in new fans. It was almost assuredly a positive for Games Workshop, but it was their IP, so they went for the nuclear option. While Board Game Geek themselves would go on to survive, any mention of any of Games Workshop's IPs would get scrubbed down if it had anything even hinting at a rule set, even if it was summarized and paraphrased rather than directly copied. But while the previous examples most likely would have been positives for Games Workshop, the next few examples were exclusively positives for them. First up, that same year, Games Workshop informed retailers who were distributing their own product that they could no longer show any Games Workshop IP content on their website or in their email, including the product being sold itself. This meant retailers would be entirely unable to name, show, or reference the very products that they were trying to sell for GW, instead having to return to in-person, phone, and mail orders only. At that same time, they also capped retailer discounts to 20% off of MSRP. Ostensibly, this was done to raise the perceived value of the brand, but the reality of it is that it forced many retailers to hold on to unsellable inventory and kept new fans from scoring entry-level deals. It also meant that when Games Workshop would launch their own online store a few years later, they didn't really have to truly compete with all the new retailers that they just handily crippled. Hot on the heels of the previous examples, Librarium Online, the Bell of Lost Souls, and Fiat212's blog would all be the next targets. Thankfully, while all three had their own issues to sort out, eventually they would all come back to life after enough time in some form or another. But here again, we face the question of why were they targeted in the first place? Librarium Online is a blog by and for Warhammer players. It is effectively free advertising for Games Workshop that only serves to promote sales. Bell of Lost Souls writes articles about Warhammer lore, again pulling in new fans who might not have otherwise seen the series, and again at zero cost to Games Workshop. And Fiat212's blog was all about the tabletop game, once again pushing new fans to check out the game itself, and once again at precisely zero cost to Games Workshop. After the dust had settled, Bell of Lost Souls actually stopped being so Warhammer-centric and instead diversified their content into other IPs, and who could blame them? And while these three weren't that bad, the same could not be said of Talk Blood Bowl, BloodBowl.net, BB Arena, NFL, Dark Reign 40k, Blood-Bowl.net, yes, there were two completely different sites with only a hyphen to separate them, Portmaw, and Fumblebowl. All 8 of these sites were permanently closed, and again, all of them were there for fan appreciation of Games Workshop properties. No piracy, no competition, nothing other than an appreciation for a company who was now suing them. But the next year would not slow the onslaught. The next target, Curse, was invariably higher stakes than anything that had come before. Beyond the fact that Curse was quite well known, they also had a staggering $11 million to fight back with, unlike any of the previous websites. Curse had a small .com empire that was designed around providing fans with their own fan sites, with one such fan site being Warhammer Alliance. Curse was sued for trademark infringement, cyber squatting on the domain name, dilution, and unfair competition, according to Games Workshop's soulless group of lawyers. Although Curse could have easily fought back and likely won due to the fan-created nature of it, they decided, perhaps justifiably, that blowing all of their seed money on a spurious lawsuit may not be the best startup plan, and decided to settle out of court with Games Workshop just 3 months after the suit was filed. Sadly, specifics on the outcome are frustratingly difficult to come by. Undoubtedly riding high on their victory against a relative giant, Games Workshop embarked on one of its most infamous lawsuits ever, a suit that even many non-tabletop gamers have heard of, and one that would have massive consequences for the company's future. Games Workshop versus Chapter House Limited Liability Corporation. Chapter House, in comparison to every previous example, unquestionably looked like the easiest suit yet. Whereas most of the others on the list weren't acting insidious or stealing funds from Games Workshop, Chapter House knowingly produced miniatures specifically for the Warhammer universe, oftentimes making direct references to what they were being made for, such as Space Marine chapters or named factions. I believe a quote from Redditor U. Blegart said it best. Most bits-making companies list their product as wink wink nudge nudge compatible with 28mm models, to avoid Games Workshop's legal department. Even then, Games Workshop has been fine issuing cease and desist to any bits maker that gets too popular. But not Chapter House. Chapter House is the honey badger of bits makers. Chapter House don't give a shit. One would expect a company on the defending side of such blatant infringement would prostrate itself before Games Workshop's legal team, given the vast divide and guilt between them and all the other defendants before them who had lost. Unfortunately for Games Workshop, they hadn't accounted for how thoroughly hated they were at this point in time. Not just in the tabletop space, but also in the legal space. And Chapter House LLC found themselves being represented entirely pro bono, thanks to a firm called Winston & Strawn. This, coupled with Games Workshop's demand that the company stop sale of all of its products, effectively shutting the company down, meant Chapter House had entirely zero incentive to cave in and settle. The fight, for once, was truly on against Games Workshop. Early into the legal proceedings, things got weird. First things first, Games Workshop decided to include not just Chapter House, but also Paulson Games in the suit. Why? Well, audibly it's because Games Workshop had heard that John Paulson, the owner of Paulson Games, had once helped co-create one of the 106 products that Chapter House was now being sued for. There was one tiny issue with this accusation, though. It was plucked entirely from thin air. It had absolutely no evidence to support the claim whatsoever. Further compounding the initial confusion was the fact that 14 of Paulson's 15 games were also being listed as offending titles, in spite of the fact that these had nothing to do with Warhammer, intentional or otherwise. It would later be ascertained that these false claims were the idea of Foley and Lardner, the law firm that Games Workshop kept on retainer. The reasoning? Chapter House was located more than 800 miles away from the firm, whereas Paulson Games was in Chicago, the same city in which Foley and Lardner worked out of. By making an entirely baseless accusation to include Paulson in the claim, Foley and Lardner could keep the suit in their hometown rather than having to travel all the way over to Texas. If that strikes you as ridiculous logic to make a false accusation in court, buckle up because the oddness just keeps on coming. Early in court, Games Workshop was asked how many lawsuits it had open. Games Workshop replied not with single-digit answers, or even a couple dozen, but several hundred open cases regarding copyright infringement. Now, that figure might not mean anything to some of you without some context, so as a point of comparison, Google has had a whopping 5 copyright infringement cases going back at least 6 years as far as I could see, and among those 5, they were the defendant in 2 of them. And Google as a company is about 500 times the size of Games Workshop. To have several hundred cases open clearly hurt Games Workshop's case, and it makes them look more like patent trolls than a legitimate company. Judge Gilbert, who had presided over the case, clearly agreed. When the dust had settled, between Paulson's spurious claims and the hundreds of open active cases, Games Workshop had lost its bid. Chapter House had won all 9 general trademark claims, more than half the disputed trademark claims, and more than half the previous use in commerce claims. While Chapter House was ordered to stop sales of things that were in direct competition with Games Workshop, such as variations on the units Games Workshop was actively selling, and it had to temporarily shut down their store until it had done so, Chapter House certainly came out better than Games Workshop did. As their legal team had been entirely pro bono, there was no court cost for them to worry about, and their damages to Games Workshop were a paltry $25,000. The shutdown of their site was temporary and easily dealt with, and while they couldn't sell direct applications and variations, they had won the most important point for themselves. Any unit the Games Workshop wasn't producing was fair game, which left the majority of its lineup intact. Chapter House not only still exists to this day, but has actually grown substantially since the court claim. Games Workshop, in comparison, not only lost, but handled their loss with all the grace of a drunken toddler. Out tens of thousands of dollars in court fees and legal costs, Games Workshop was also in an even more precarious position. In losing their bid against Chapter House, a precedent had been set. If Games Workshop couldn't produce a product or prove that its IP was unique, other companies were totally allowed to make money off of Games Workshop's rightfully plagiarized works. Further kicking them while they were down, Games Workshop's simultaneous case against Spots the Space Marine, undoubtedly its second most infamous case, had also been thrown out. Spots the Space Marine is a novel that in no way, shape, or form references Games Workshop's IP. It does have a fairly obvious inspiration from Starship Troopers, which it wears on its sleeve, which is sort of like Games Workshop except for it admits to doing it, but Games Workshop can't claim trademarks from an IP that it was also derivative of. Instead, Games Workshop claimed that Space Marine was a term from its own IP, but there was one small problem with enforcing that claim. The term preceded their company by half a century and was commonly used among various IPs and is a term composed exclusively of standard language. Much like Chapter House, author MCA Horgoth would refuse to cave in to GW's bullying and would fight and win against them in court. Games Workshop's response to these dual losses was swift, severe, and stupid. All the factions that had normal names, such as Space Marines, Imperial Guards, and Sisters of Battle, were run through a Latin name generator, ending up as Adeptus Astartes, Astra Militarum, and Adeptus Sororitas, making them easier to defend in IP claims. Virtually overnight, Games Workshop would gut every unit on a codex that didn't have a model currently being produced for it. While this would barely affect certain factions, others, most notably the Tyranids, became unusable from one day to the next, as the viable half of their lineup had suddenly been removed. For the legions of fans who were already on the border of outright hatred with Games Workshop, it was the final push needed to fully get there. With throngs of longtime fans abandoning them and investor confidence lost at Games Workshop's future, its stock price fell by a third overnight, and sales virtually halted outright. Worldwide, the general consensus was that Games Workshop was not long for this world. Investors were demanding changes before the company folded entirely. Kirby and his selections would be unanimously removed from management positions, and the company would make the first intelligent decision it had made in years, appointing Kevin Roundtree to manage the company instead. Roundtree knew exactly what had almost killed the company, its almost antagonistic attitude towards its own fans. For any company, that would be a net negative, but for one that serves an entirely niche market and is virtually dependent on repeat customers, it was a death knell. Roundtree immediately set about trying to return longtime gamers to the company. White Dwarf magazine would go on back to celebrating custom works, decades of complaints would try to get addressed head on, problematic materials like Finecast would be replaced or improved, new starter packs would be made available for new gamers, high-quality video games would be commissioned, codexes for all races would get more frequent updates. Roundtree was determined to right the sinking ship. While investors wouldn't see the fruits of his labors for a few more years, he had successfully managed to stem the bleeding. The stock price had stabilized, and there was finally some capital available to address the damage that Games Workshop had inflicted on itself. Roundtree's long-term vision would become almost prophetic, because 3 years after his appointment, Games Workshop would explode in value. Having hovered below a stock value of £1,000 for its entire life, getting to a stock value of $2,000 would have been impressive, which would have doubled its value. Instead, thanks to the intelligent moves of its leadership, Games Workshop would shoot up to $10,000 before the end of 2020. Now, one might assume that following a plan like that forever would be the logical choice then. If it worked well so far, why not continue with the same MO? Well, there was one giant reason on the horizon that we'll discuss in a moment, but long story short, something internally at Games Workshop had changed. For decades, Games Workshop's value was in its IP, not actually in its models. The models were of middling quality at best and were horrifically overpriced for what they were. The constantly changing meta meant that those expensive models could pivot from a useful part of an army to a paperweight, right next to one codex change. But Games Workshop could still get people to buy those models because their IP was so universally well known in the miniatures market. They were effectively too big to fail without bringing the entire miniatures market down with them. Games Workshop, while it had diversified its income into books, video games, and an upcoming video service, was still overwhelmingly dependent on its miniature sales for income. Cast molds, which are what Games Workshop uses, are expensive initial investments, but once set up, they make for incredibly cheap production, meaning that their expensive models effectively just needed to pay off the molds, and after that they would become pure profit. Such a system works great if you can move enough numbers to get that mold paid off. A $50 unit would only cost a few cents, maybe $1 to produce, meaning that profits would explode given enough sales. And on a company the size of Games Workshop, that will invariably always be possible. But Games Workshop wasn't foolish, it could see the looming specter coming for it. .3D printers had existed for years, but remained very little threat to Games Workshop's sales. While Games Workshop's plastics were not the highest quality plastics around, they were still a country mile better than the results from 3D filament printing. While injection molding occasionally leaves the odd tag and a visible seam, 3D printing filaments was infamous for it. Details were low, flaws were high, so even if you wanted to invest the massive outlay for a 3D printer in that era, you would get laughed out of any tournament you showed up to with the jagged minis produced by a 3D printer. While 3D filament printing was steadily improving, it would be a long while before it would become remotely close to the quality of injection molding. Judging from the slow improvements to 3D printing, Games Workshop, perhaps justifiably, figured it had a long time to deal with such an issue before it became a true threat. But then last year, something happened that would threaten the very core of Games Workshop's business model. Resin 3D printers had arrived, gotten their accuracy up to incredible detail levels, and their price had fallen dramatically. Games Workshop could handle competitors making products and selling them, but how do you handle an entire technology acting as your competitor? Well, effectively, there were really only 4 options for them on the table. Rely on the goodwill of its community, change your pricing or business model to account for this new thing, try and take on the entire 3D printing industry head on, or pivot even further away from your miniatures and try to focus on other profitable ventures using the IP. Relying on goodwill was a tricky, if not impossible, play. While Games Workshop had definitely earned back some goodwill that had lost at its worst period, it was still far, far from away from a beloved company. 4 good years would hardly scrub away the reputation it had earned from 4 decades of downright evil actions. Heck, even companies with a good reputation are still prime targets for piracy. Before Cyberpunk 2077, CD Projekt Red was unquestionably the most beloved AAA developer around, and yet The Witcher 2 was pirated 4.5 million times after launch, compared to a meager 1 million copies sold. Reputation is great, but given the choice between spending good money on something and getting it for free or for cheap, the vast majority of people will go the latter route. So goodwill, while helpful, would not bail Games Workshop out, even if they had it in the first place. The second option in front of them was to try and lower their prices to better compete with the cost of 3D printed models. Now, price cutting is ordinarily a gamble unless you have one of two things going for you: monopolization and margin. Games Workshop found itself in the enviable position of having both of those things going for it. You might have heard that 3D printers have dramatically lowered the cost of producing things, but that's only true in small scales. Remember how I said that Games Workshop had to simply pay off its molds before they became profitable? Those molds are initially very expensive, usually up in the 5-figure range. So if you're only producing a few hundred of something, a $20,000 mold isn't going to compete with a $200 3D printer, even if the cost of production is lower per unit. But Games Workshop sells thousands and thousands of models, so that ejection mold handily pays for itself thanks to the reduced production costs. If you've watched Commissar Gamza's videos about 3D printed minis versus purchased ones, the 3D printed ones are usually still $5 or more per unit on larger units, and as someone with a resin printer themselves, that pricing seems generous. An injection molded unit is likely under $1 to produce, so even if Games Workshop wanted to compete at a perfect 1-to-1, they could still get about 80% gross for every unit sold after the molds have been paid off if they wanted to go down to $5 and directly compete with 3D printed models. But they would never have to go that low. Not a lot of people are going to want to spend a few $100s buying a 3D printer, learning how to print, dealing with part preparations and processing and post-processing, finding models, dealing with the smells and the messes just to save $10 on an army. Most people are willing to pay for some convenience. Even if Games Workshop models were 5 times as expensive or 10 times as expensive, most folks are willing to pay $25 or $50 to Games Workshop rather than dealing with everything required to produce it themselves for $5. However, as much as Games Workshop could easily lower their price to compete with the excessively large gap, as I said earlier, it's not an intelligent thing to do. Unlike what a lot of consumers think, more sales do not make up for lower margins most of the time, and that would especially hold up here. If a mold is costing Games Workshop $20,000 and it costs them $1 to produce a unit, and say packaging, shipping, and everything else, we're looking at an additional $4 worth of expenses per unit, we can mathematically see what will happen to their income. To break even at $50 per unit requires them to sell just 445 units. After that, they begin to make $45 net per unit. But to break even at $25 per unit requires them to sell 1,000 units at minimum just to pay for the mold. And after that, they still only make $20 per unit. At 2,000 units sold, this means a total profit of $69,979 for a higher margin set, but just $20,000 for the half price example. It would require them to sell more than 3.5 times as many just to earn back the same amount of money. Those numbers get better for the half price example as we get closer and closer to infinity, but they will still never actually get better than requiring more than double the amount of required sales. However, that's just one potential option. Another one would be not to change their pricing structure per se, but to provide limited use STL files themselves, which would in turn make even hosting Warhammer STL files a direct competitor, which would make it extremely easy to fight in court. Hell, Games Workshop could have even sold resin printers that they knew were of a sufficient quality level to print miniatures, in which case you're now making money on the front and back end of the exchange. When the music industry was facing downloaded pirated copies from people, they tried doubling down and fighting it, but in reality, the thing that saved them wasn't trying to fight it in court. It was pivoting their business model to account for the new desire to simply download tracks at their leisure. Not only did digital storefronts pop into being, but even music production companies like Sony ensured that they had not just the sales of songs, but the sales of MP3 players as well, which would give them an enhanced market capture. Games Workshop's situation is so similar, you can effectively just change the names of a few things and it would appear entirely identical. Unfortunately for Games Workshop now, it's likely too late for them to make that change. The STL files are absolutely everywhere now. The cat's already out of the bag. Alright, so our first two examples won't help, but surely Games Workshop isn't stupid enough to take on an entire industry, right? Well, they actually put off doing this for quite some time, but there's actually a method in which they can fight back against it, and they've been fairly successful at it. First things first, banning 3D printed models from showing up in their tournaments has created a valuation for the purchased models that simply doesn't exist for the printed ones. And for many small local companies, they're going to be aware of what's been sold lately, so someone suddenly appearing with a whole army full of custodies out of the blue is going to set off some red flags, so even without checking, there's a certain amount of faith there. And second, while what you do in the privacy of your own home is beyond Games Workshop's reach, what ends up on websites is a much different conversation. In May of this year, Games Workshop began a campaign of sending out cease and desist to 3D sculpts that were very obviously competing with Games Workshop's IP. While your initial instinct might be to say, who cares, it's their own printer to do whatever they want with, bear in mind, IP protection doesn't suddenly end at intangible things. If I can suddenly upload an exact replication of a Ford Mustang and tell people exactly how to make it themselves for like $10, Ford would be 100% within their legal rights to sue me into the next century. Something you need to understand about copying or even creating something is that when it comes from another IP, you can't simply make a version of it just because you want to. Legally, there needs to be a justification for it, with parody being one of the most famous examples of that reasoning. It's also worth noting that if Games Workshop tried taking on all of 3D printing at once, then yeah, of course they would lose, so they're being tactical about it. They're going after hosting services, especially those that offer printing and shipping on individual IP claims, much like how YouTube gets copyright claims from outside industries and simply removes the content in question. This keeps costs low for everyone involved. Games Workshop doesn't have to hire lawyers to handle this, and 3D stores don't have to go to court. However, this is only a stopgap. This won't stop the issue entirely. Much like what we said about the music industry, trying to take on an entire technology is likely doomed from the beginning. Now, because options 1 through 3 are unlikely to succeed, Games Workshop has tried a bit of the fourth option in terms of diversifying their income stream. The most famous, or perhaps infamous, example would be the upcoming Warhammer Plus subscription. We'll talk more about that later, but in the interim, let's move over to one of their other income streams. Most people are well aware of the video games. In fact, a common trend I'm finding in videos these days is that people will say that the video games were how they discovered Warhammer, rather than Warhammer leading them to that video game. Love it or hate it, Games Workshop's current tactic of giving any developer at least one chance has been paying dividends for them. Most people don't end up remembering the failed games, whereas games like Total Warhammer, Vermintide, and Dawn of War have gone on to become exceedingly well known. And for smaller developers like Slytherin, Stremon Studio, Echo, and Casado, it has given them a chance, and those developers have run with it, providing both them and Games Workshop an enhanced user base that neither would have otherwise had. Coupled with their other passive income streams like codexes, novels, and events, Games Workshop potentially has the option to try and ride out the inevitable gutting of their model sales. But let there be no mistake, they are still overwhelmingly dependent on their models for income. And this is what has likely led Games Workshop to attempt their second and now famous attack against the most ardent fans. I suppose we should begin our final chapter with a second history lesson, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. Things came to a boil when Brother Alphabusa announced that they would be ending the series if the Emperor had a text-to-speech device, a wildly entertaining pseudo-parody of the lore. His reasonings was that the new zero-tolerance policy towards fan videos put him square in the crosshairs of GW's legal team, and he figured he would invariably be on the hit list, being one of the most well-known Warhammer series on YouTube. However, we need to clarify things because a lot of people are upset about almost the entirely wrong things. First things first, he was never contacted by Games Workshop nor given a DMCA claim or anything else along those lines. This was an entirely preemptive act on his part. Secondly, this new policy that he referenced is anything but new. It has been a part of Games Workshop policy for 14 years now, as we've discussed earlier. Thirdly, while many people claim this is due to Alpha's rather sizable Patreon income, the majority of that Patreon income didn't actually become a thing until after they announced the cancellation of the series, as a show of support from the community. Okay, but if nothing actually happened and nothing has changed, why yank the series? Simple, because things have changed. A lot of other series had been getting recently targeted by Games Workshop, with the most infamous one being the Astartes series by Sodas. Animators in particular seem to be feeling the heat from Games Workshop, and the timing of all this wasn't coincidental. Games Workshop has their own subscription service coming, so these fan animators represented either resources or competition. Some, like Sodas, were simply bought out, removing their series from YouTube in order to move it to their own service later. Others, like Alpha, knew that taking on Games Workshop in court would be a one-way ticket to bankruptcy. Either way, the old Games Workshop seemed to be making a return. On the other side of things, Games Workshop effectively had given up on their crusade against 3D modelers. It used to be that finding an STL file of a Warhammer unit would need to be downloaded pronto, because once it got noticed, it would be hit with a DMCA claim inside of a week. Now, I've been monitoring 5 separate models for 3 months now, and not a single one of the 5 has yet to be taken down. So now, Games Workshop finds itself in a very committed position. The floodgates on 3D printing have already burst. There is no stopping it now, which means they need their extracurricular services to succeed. Well, if you're uninformed investor number 239439, you likely look at Nintendo's policy of having utter control of all aspects of their IP, and you think to yourself, well, that makes sense. We should do the same thing. After all, Nintendo doesn't allow fan games of their franchises, and Disney isn't letting any fans produce their own films. Why would Games Workshop suddenly allow fans to create their own free videos against their own paid service? Well, as we said at the beginning, a large part of it boils down to scale. Warhammer, for all the progress it's made these last few years, is still far from a household name, and limiting their market reach will at best slow the growth of their fan base, at worst stunt it completely. But as we've seen historically, when Games Workshop begins to get a little too uppity, the fanbase can rise against them quickly, and that is the biggest threat to Games Workshop right now. You might not know this, but Games Workshop has flirted with bankruptcy many times throughout its history, beyond the Chapter House loss. Though the current Games Workshop is dramatically larger than it ever was historically, they are still a long ways off of being infallible, and I think Games Workshop's next couple of years may either make or break the company. Is this just pie-in-the-sky thinking, another false prediction from an angry fan? Well, yes, but I also do believe that there's evidence to support that claim. Let's take a look at Games Workshop's future if they have an angry fan base at their heels. Their miniatures are exceedingly expensive, and they won't be able to compete against 3D printers for long, given the excessive price gap between them and how cheap 3D printers have become. There's no more goodwill left from the community, and they haven't put themselves into a position to make money off those 3D prints themselves. So this alone could spell doom for the company, as the vast majority of their income remains tied to the sale of their physical goods, chiefly the miniatures themselves. Well, sure, some of you might think that's why they're aggressively pushing for video games and streaming services, but these two are now in an extremely precarious position. Let's start with the latter. Warhammer Plus is almost assuredly dead on arrival now. Most streaming services actually lose money, and I don't mean some rinky-dink service that you've never heard of, like all of the major ones. NBC's Peacock lost almost $1 billion in its inaugural year. Disney Plus lost $3.9 billion its first year and $2.4 billion the year following, only finally becoming profitable this year. Amazon Prime has lost money on its music and TV streaming its entire life. Spotify loses $2.2 million every single day. Hell, the two biggest streaming services in the world, YouTube and Netflix, each spent over a decade losing money every single quarter and only survived due to constant cash infusions. Now, Games Workshop isn't exactly a tiny company, but relative to the names above, it absolutely is. It sure as hell can't survive posting billion-dollar losses. Hell, it can't afford to suffer 10% of the losses Disney and NBC posted. And while the subscription offers a couple outside of incentives to justify its own cost, like, a free miniature and some reading materials, it won't have a chance at competing with the general streaming services at $6 a month, when someone could get Netflix or Amazon Prime subscription for almost the same price. Understand, I'm not referring to the most ardent fanboys here, I'm referring to the general public. And the only clientele that it likely would have, those aforementioned hardcore fans, have now been incentivized to fight against Games Workshop all over again. they have likely doomed the service before it ever even gets a chance to launch. Okay, so there's two of the three biggest profitability options gone, but what about the third? Well, that could go either way, really. The name Warhammer is losing a lot of meaning in the gaming space. Whereas Warhammer games were once special affairs that would naturally excite you with the concept, with the amount of shovelware now present, having Warhammer in the title of the game is now irrelevant at best, negative at worst. That said, it doesn't particularly matter whether or not the games still sell. Games Workshop has steadily trended upwards by 30% in royalty profitabilities year over year for the last 4 years in a row, since 2017 when they were on their upwards trend. While this sounds impressive, that means they still cap out at gross profits of just £15 million, and that's before any cost. That's gross. That is certainly too small to keep the company going. One option they could commit to is to try and start their own studios and start making games themselves in order to lock in all of the income from those games. But that would require even more capital outlay, and they almost assuredly don't have the revenue available to pull that off, hot on the heels of their upcoming streaming service. Needless to say, this doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the ability of their third branch to support the company moving forward. That's not to say this company is unanimously doomed. People said the same thing in 2013, yet here we are 8 years later. But I don't think the future looks particularly bright for the boys in Lenton. Anyways though, that's enough listening to me. Let's go ahead and conclude this one. Let me know if you enjoyed the new format at all. I thought I'd try my hand at something new. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.